To best explain the 5-0 paradox, I'll be reading directly from an article that can be found in the LPU Discord, pinned in the Disk Detainer section. The article is titled Disk Detainer Lock Info Guides. In operation, the shape of the keyway means that as the disks rotate by varying amounts, they cut off some of the space available for tools, including the center of the lock. This gives rise to the famous 5-0 problem, where any picking tip which occupies 180 degrees of space and rotates about the axis of the lock must have a supporting arm moving through 90 degrees to properly position the disks. As the arm cannot have zero thickness, this means it must clash to set a 0 disk behind a 5, or vice versa. Fortunately, this is not a problem if the arm supporting the picking tip is sufficiently thin. Under tension, the round sidebar will push down into a true gate and correctly align a disc which is offset by up to half the thickness of the sidebar. Therefore, maximum minimum rotation discs can be under or overset slightly without preventing the lock from opening, giving enough space for a thin picking arm. The pick design is simple, but can be fiddly to manufacture. Here are the measurements we're aiming for, but we really won't measure them until the very end. To begin, I take the key, and generally there's some wear where the first disc starts near the bow of the key. So I'm marking how deep the bitting is here with a marker on the bottom of the key and the top being where the first disc was. Now I'm going to draw a line down the back, the ridge. I don't want to grind that section off. That should be the center of the back of the spring roll. And we're going to begin grinding at the opening of the spring. And we'll have the lock nearby so that we can, when it gets closer, we can test to see if it fits into the keyhole. You really want a snug fit. A cup of water is here for quenching the metal when it gets too hot. Our first test, still doesn't fit. Get back to grinding. Pretty much how we want it. So I'll work on shaping the back of the pick, rounding it, because if it has harder edges, it can catch on the discs when you're trying to move in between them. Now with our Dremel, with its cutting disc installed, we're going to take the key and make sure with this key the first disc is a 4-cut, so we know exactly where the first disc is and we can measure the last disc. Even though the last disc, we shouldn't ever need to pick that because that is occupied by the tension, but it's nice to have that little bit of space. So we're going to cut in here, making sure we don't cut into the very center where the arm of the picking tip will be. Do it on the other side. And now we're going to make the cuts for the picking tip. We'll leave the picking tip thicker than we want the final result to be. We'll do the fine tuning with hand file. Now that we have these 4 major cuts, I will go piece by piece, bit by bit, grinding off the sections in between. Back to the bench grinder to take off the really rough edges and get the supporting rod for the picking tip pretty close to how wide we want it to be. Back to the table vise. We're using our triangular file now, and I didn't mention this earlier. Whenever I put this spring clip in the table vise, I use an ejector pin. I place it inside this spring so that the vise doesn't close it down. This metal's pretty tough, so I'm sure you could vise it down and it probably wouldn't even move it, but I do it just to be safe. And I'm filing this down to the final desired thickness. I notice it's still too thick, so I'm going to come back at it with the grinding wheel on the Dremel. Shave off that bit of extra. Being very careful. You can see in the vise that it didn't pinch the spring clip because you can see the ejector pin moving around. Not great. It should be pretty snug. I'm pretty happy with this tip. You don't see much wiggle in it. This is a good opportunity to test the measurements. You can measure that to make sure it's the right millimeter that we're looking for. Here we vise down on the picking rods. The picking tip is flush with the top of the vise, and I'll file it with the triangular file. Ideally, we'd like it to be 1/2 of a millimeter thick so that it could best slip in between discs where the spacer is and not catch 2 discs at the same time. After some fine filing, we will test it. It passes into the first disc, that's good. Now to see if it fits in the spacer, it does, and you can see it's not turning the second disc. It is tight. I might file this a little more finely, but it's really close, and I'm happy with it.